Yes, the Peripatetic Mr. Reber. I'm going to talk a little bit about his geographic and intellectual travels, about Reber in Canada, and then a bit about the question that everyone always asks about Reber that I don't really know the answer to. Here's what we all know. In 1937, he designed and built the first parabolic antenna. Built it in his backyard. He was doing this because nobody had followed up on Jansky's detections, and he thought somebody ought to. Galactic radio noise in 1939. He published his first radio astronomy papers in 1940, despite a very dubious reception by the astronomy establishment. Who is this person? He doesn't have any degrees. He doesn't have any astronomy training. What is this stuff called radio astronomy? You know, what is he doing here? He detected solar radio emission in 1943. He extended his radio astronomy research to the ionosphere and long hectometer wavelengths. He researched and published in a wide variety of other fields. He lived in Tasmania the last half of his very long life, but traveled to many places. And he was convinced until his death in 2002 that the Big Bang is bunk. Peripatetic, he's traveling from place to place, especially working or based in various places for relatively short periods. Well, that's a good description of Grote Reber. Geographically, after he left Wheaton, he was in DC, in Alaska, in Hawaii, a number of times at NRAO and Green Bank, the Netherlands, Canada, Tasmania, Sydney, New Zealand. And intellectually, it went from lava flows to electric cars. 1933, he got his degree in electrical engineering, specialty in electronics and communications. He was a ham radio operator for 10 years. And then he said, well, I've done everything I can do here. I don't need to do this anymore. In the archives, we have several boxes of his QSL cards from all the places he contacted, but then he was done. In 33 through 46, he had a series of jobs at Chicago area companies, including military-related work during World War II. And he'd take the train to Chicago, and he'd take the train home again, and then he'd sleep for a couple of hours, and then he'd do his radio observations. When his mother died in 1945, he really didn't have anything to hold him in Wheaton, and he looked for a place where he could set up a radio program. He wanted to build a large dish, and he thought it would cost him about $100,000. He looked, and none of the academic institutions were interested in him. So finally, he went to the National Bureau of Standards. He sold them his Wheaton dish. He packed it all up. We have all the freight papers for when he was shipping it off to NBS. He sold it to them with all its instrumentation for $18,570, recouping what he estimated to be the $11,473 of his own funds that he'd spent on his radio research up to this time. So off he went. It's the only time, the 47 to 51 is the only time he received a salary for radio astronomy work. So there he is with a Würzburg antenna there. While at the National Bureau of Standards, he participated in a solar eclipse expedition run by the NRL to Attu, Alaska. We have a whole slew of photographs of this that he took of this expedition. Well, this was a very successful expedition, despite the fact that it was observed during a torrential downpour of rain and a gale. This is one of my favorite pictures of Reber. I think of this as Reber as garden gnome. Okay, he was increasingly frustrated in Washington, D.C. There was no support for this telescope he wanted to build. He hated the atmosphere. This was the McCarthy era. But most of all, I think he hated working under bureaucracy. This is not someone who worked well with bureaucracy. Didn't like being told what to do. He had his own ideas of how things should be done, and this just didn't work. So in 1951, he left DC with no warning whatsoever and went to a mountaintop in Hawaii. He built an antenna there, a rotating antenna to do interferometry. He was inspired by the Australian sea interferometry work. He was plagued by ionospheric refraction and by interference. And so after his time there, he just gave it all up, left the telescope, moved to Tasmania in 1954. In 1957, there was a huge ice storm that collapsed the telescope. And then, oops, we've lost a photo here. It's just vanished. There's a big red X down here of the image. It's interesting.
Huh. Yeah, the image cannot be displayed.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Well, this was a photograph of, he'd written on the back of a manila envelope in which he had some papers about this, and he says that after the ice storm in November of 1957, they cleared the remains of the telescope, the wreckage to one side, and it finally burned it in August of 1958. So this was an ignominious end for this particular telescope. Well, long wavelength work is best with a minimum of ionospheric disturbance. And there are two places in the world where you can do this kind of work, northern Canada or Tasmania. Well, I know I'm speaking to a lot of Canadians here, so they might have chosen northern Canada, but given the weather, I certainly wouldn't, and Reber didn't either. He went to Tasmania. He built two dipole arrays in Tasmania. The first one was in Kempton, and he published several papers from that. He built a second one in Bothwell, again, several more papers. And when I say he built the antennas, literally he built them. He had a little help occasionally from someone to put up the poles or to put up the wires, but most of it he did on his own. Same thing in Hawaii. So when he got to Tasmania, his travels from the bottom of the world began. Here he is ice skating in Leiden in February of 1956. And he went to Greenbank. He retrieved his telescope from his Wheaton telescope from the National Bureau of Standards. It was still, it had never been unpacked. I don't.
It was built in Stirling with the red, white, and blue antennas that you saw him standing by, one of the Würzburgs. But it had not been shipped to Boulder.
That's right. It never been shipped to Boulder. Okay. So they packed it up and sent it to Greenbank. And the wooden members had rotted, but the metal pieces were still intact. But Reber still had his original plans, so in Greenbank they cut new pieces of wood and so on, and it was reconstructed with the new wooden parts and a lovely concrete base, which you see them pouring here. He had a number of other trips to Greenbank, summer of 78, spring of 83, winter of 88, spring of 95. He had shipped, as I mentioned yesterday, these 98 packing crates of material to Greenbank that included all sorts of stuff, including old electronic equipment, miscellaneous stuff from, as I said, boomerangs, a lot of dried up ballpoint pens that he'd picked up at various places along the way. We have lava samples. We have cutlery from ships and airlines. We have, he was a pack rat.
Were there any 4-leaf clovers?
There were some dried up bean vines. Here he is in Greenbank in 95. He's tinkering with some of the electronic equipment that he sent, and the other picture shows him with David Jansky, Carl Jansky's son. He went to Ohio State. He got an honorary doctorate in 1962. They're at the Big Ear construction site. There's Ko Chu Menon wrote Reber, John Krauss, and Bill Nash. And then you see Reber in Krauss's classroom. You can see a bit of the helical antenna up there behind him. Krauss and Reber were great friends. Here he is with Jesse Greenstein at the Jansky Monument Ceremony in 1998. Well, Travels of the Inquiring Mind. In 57 through 59, he published 4 papers on Hawaiian meteorology, work he had done while he was in Hawaii. 59 to 62, and 62, 2 papers on the age of lava flows on Haleakala. Here is a picture of some of the carbon samples he took or lava samples he took, and a little map from the actual publication showing where he took it. If you look carefully at the lid of the jar, which we had, you will see a picture of Reber reflected in there. I tried to take a picture of this, and all I got was terrible reflection, so I took it to our graphics people and said, can you make me a nice picture of this? And they did, but they couldn't resist inserting this little photo. This is the picture, I think, that Woody showed yesterday of Reber at age about 29 or so. You just barely see it in there. And he published 3 papers on his reversed bean vine research. He did some of this in the summer in Green Bank in the summer of 1960. Here is some of the data he took. He was experimenting to determine whether manually reversing the way the beans twined around the support would increase the weight of the yield. He published a paper on carbon dating of Aboriginal kitchen middens in Tasmania. We have slews of photographs of these various kitchen middens. In August of '65, he went to New Zealand for this Congress of the Association for the Advancement of Science. He presented 4 papers in 4 days. Here's Monday morning, this is. Yes, Monday morning, this is hectometer radio astronomy. Monday afternoon, reversed bean vines. Tuesday morning, solar and sidereal protons. Took the day off on Wednesday. And on Thursday, he did a paper on the age of Tasmanian Aborigines. He was in the 70s. He was increasingly concerned about the growing energy crisis, about the use of fossil fuels, so he built himself an energy-efficient house in Tasmania. He moved in in December of 1980, which of course was the beginning of the Tasmanian summer. And in '81, he had been concerned about whether this was going to actually work. He wrote to John Galt saying, so far it's been pleasant. Proof of performance will be next winter. Well, the house did perform extremely well. And in 1990, he received an energy efficiency award. He built Pixie, a battery-powered car that he used to travel around Ottawal and Hobart. He was an inveterate record keeper, how far he walked in a day. Here he is with the Hobart Walking Club. He's there in the front with the dark sweater with the red stripe across it. All the things he sent us, you'd open a box and there'd be a pedometer here, and you'd open another box and there'd be a pedometer in there, so there'd probably half a dozen pedometers. He was very interested in the speed of the mail. He noted on much of his correspondence has penciled notes of Reber saying, it was posted on such and such a day, and it was this much postage, and it arrived here, and so on. And often his correspondence back to people, he would say, I received your letter of this date with this much postage, which arrived here on such and such a date. Well, he has, the top one here was the posted from Penticton on September, and $3.08 postage, and posted on the 10th of September, arrived on the 18th of September in Tasmania. That's pretty good. The second one was posted see, I can't read these notes here. There it is. March of 82, 60 cents postage, 4th of March, arrived the 15th of March. The bottom one didn't do so well. It was a covering letter for Bruce Veit's thesis, and it took several months, so I think it must have gone by sea mail. He kept records of the lifespan of the fluorescent light tubes in his energy-efficient house. He sent away for what ended up being hundreds and hundreds of pounds of catalogs and brochures on all kinds of topics. These are some of them packed up in potato sacks there after his death. He was curious about everything. He reminds me of Rudyard Kipling's The Elephant's Child, who had insatiable curiosity and always did what he wanted to do and didn't listen to what anybody else said. First record I can find of Reber in Canada, he went to the AAS meeting in 1949 in Ottawa, and he took this picture. Arthur Covington is there, turned towards the camera with the suit on. And then, Tim, how do I get the?
Oh, sure. This is.
I can't quite read.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Colonel Seeger is under the dish.
There we go. Okay. Then John Hagen in the hat, Jean-Francois Denis, Alan Shapley, Charles Seeger, sitting right under the dish, and Wilfred Mead with the white shirt there. That's at Goth Hill. Yeah. He went to a meeting from Greenbank. He was there in 1959. He went to a meeting in Greenbank in Ottawa, and he wrote to Charles Schauer of the Research Corporation that it was a successful meeting. It's good to see how others do things from time to time. He was here in Penticton, probably in the fall. This is from an October 4th letter written after he arrived back in Tasmania, and he's saying the installation is well worth seeing. I had a pleasant few days here. Not going to compete with mine because there's different wavelength. And they're well on the way to an installation which is nearly identical to what Menon proposes to start in India about 6 years from now.
Who is this to?
This was to someone named Ginny. I don't know who. It's Dear Ginny.
How long did it take to get to Ginny?
This is his copy of his carbon copy, so I don't know how long it took to get to Ginny. He wrote to Galt saying he wants to see the progress made. This is in 1975. And Galt writes back and said, well, we're on to a new project now. In 1979, he writes to Galt and he says, well, I was there about 4 years ago and you were building this, and send me results. So Galt sent Peter Dewdney's thesis on aperture synthesis and deep sky survey. And in August of 1980, Reber writes back to Galt. He said, this is a wonderful thesis. It's a thorough job. Notice if you can see it, his Reber spelling of thorough, Thoro. He's greatly impressed. And then he says, I've decided to gradually to disperse my assets in Canada while I'm still here instead of after I'm gone. And as a modest start, you will receive in early September a check for $30,000. And use it as you see fit. Just tell me what you're going to use it for. Well, this is an interesting letter to get. So Galt writes back and says he's just returned from a conference and was surprised to receive your letter. Needless to say, we're grateful. We'll put it in a separate trust account. And they write about possible uses for the money. Well, one was to pay expenses for visiting scientists. to assist in design study, phase 2 for the for the long baseline array. Thinking about building a pendulum, okay, and to purchase apparatus required when regular funds have been exhausted. Well, Reber said he wanted his donation to remain anonymous, but they could publicize it as an anonymous donation because perhaps then it would be seed money for other donations. So there was a notice that appeared in Cassiopea talking about this donation. So then, a little over a year later, Reber writes to Galt again. He says, some more money's come to hand. I'm going to send you another $30,000. Use it as you see fit. Just give me a rundown on how it was expended. So that's in November of '81. He gets a letter back from Lloyd Higgs explaining that Galt has stepped down and Higgs is now director, and this is how we're going to use the money. This is what the instrument is going to be like. And he goes on and he says, we're already referring to this as the Reber facility, being constructed principally by 2 graduate students from the University of Alberta. And the equipment is being financed from your bequest. We're delighted that you've been so kind to offer us a further donation of $30,000. We're pleased to accept it. So finally, in October of 1985, Reber is here again for the 25th anniversary celebration and the formal opening of the 408 megahertz Reber facility. He went a few other places while he was in Canada in '85, gave a colloquium, was at Shirley's Bay, spent a few days at Algonquin Park. In the fall and winter of 1986, he apparently worked at Ashton for several months, and the observations continued remotely after he left. There's correspondence about purchasing equipment for ionoson work at Ashton. And in 1983, he asks Paul Feldman, he's trying to organize having sent to Tasmania a sample of the tuner boxes that he had built here because he couldn't get good ones built in Tasmania, and he wanted a sample of what was done here so he could show them how to do it. He was in Ottawa again in December of '87 for a symposium. In February of '88, probably part of the same visit, he gave some talks, and the flyer says he was a visiting research scientist at Hertzberg. He planned to do an elaborate reconnaissance trip at Georgian Bay in 1989. There were all sorts of arrangements made for trucks, equipment, lodging. It sounded very complex from the correspondence. And then he abruptly canceled the trip. I don't have a copy of this 6 July 1989 letter. All I have is anxious letter from the Canadians saying, well, we've canceled all these arrangements. We're concerned about why you're not coming. We hope you're not having health problems, and so on. And I couldn't find anything that referred to any reasons why he canceled this trip, but he did. He continued his interest, however, in Canadian ionospheric data, and he began correspondence to looking at the comparisons for different sites, and he decided that the West Coast, Graham Island in the Queen Charlotte district of BC off the shore from Prince Rupert would be an ideal spot to do some ionospheric work. Well, this begins a long set of correspondence and so on with what Reber perceived to be obstructionist bureaucracy, i.e. bureaucracy that wouldn't let him do what he wanted to do. He wants to use some land where he can do essentially what he did in Tasmania, clear the land, erect poles, build wires, make observations. He has a long correspondence with someone named David Slater. I have no idea who this person is. There's no letterhead or anything. My best guess is he was somebody that dealt in real estate. And David Slater keeps saying, well, you got to do this. And Reber says, I don't want to buy anything or rent anything. I just want to use the land. We can have a fee for the nice fee for the owner. Well, Slater tells him you can't acquire land here unless you're a Canadian citizen or a corporation. He applies to set up a corporation, which is approved, but most of the land is owned by the Crown, and any large flat parcel is owned by Crown land, and you'll have to deal under the laws and regulations here. What you did in Tasmania has nothing whatsoever with what's done here. Slater sends him this chart of island rates for labor, equipment, roads, poles, etc., and says, you're looking at hundreds and thousands of dollars. Are you prepared for such an expense? And finally, Reber throws in the towel, and he says, I've gotten cold feet. I'd be spending half my time up there, half down here. Looks to me as this project falls in the foolish category, and I've decided to bow out. Now remember, Reber is 82 years old or 81 years old at this point. So he's finally slowing down a little. So the big question that people ask is, where did the money come from? Well, he inherited some from his father, probably not a very large amount because his father was just a small businessman. He did make astute investments in the 30s. Guest appointments gave him support, but no salary. Remember, the only time he got a salary was 47 to 51. He was frugal. He kept track of every single penny he spent, used his neighbor's sheep to cut the grass, reused postage stamps if they hadn't been canceled, and so on. He did get some financial support from the Research Corporation. He got $200,000 over, but that's only $6,000 a year. He got hooked up with the Research Corporation because he saw an article by Charles Schauer in October of 1950 in Physics Today talking about their grant program in physics. So Reber wrote to him, and he became a good personal friend of Schauer. The Research Corporation did all sorts of stuff for him. They helped manage his finances. They collected mail. They did the kind of things that they served as his sort of office in the United States, ordered hearing aid cables for him, and so on. He donated generously to charity and to support young radio astronomers, and he donated to worthy astronomy projects and institutions. His final travels. After Reber died, the executor of his estate, who was as quirky a person as Reber, probably why they got along, decided that small portions of Reber's ashes should go to the various radio astronomy observatories around the world. Now, this was the executor's idea, not Reber's. Accordingly, these little little metal boxes were made and inscribed with Reber's dates, and they were taken to observatories around the world, and ceremonies of varying nature took place around the world, so the Peripatetic Mr. Reber is still spread around the world.
I'm sure you know this because it's from your archive, but Reber and Ralph Williamson were great friends.
Mm-hmm.
They knew each other personally. There's lots of interesting, very valuable astronomical correspondence.
Right, yeah. Reber corresponded with
And the other thing is that the observatory on Maui, Joe Pawsey was asked by Reber about this, and Joe wrote a letter saying it will not work because, as seen from the top of Haleakala, the Earth is not flat.
Yeah.
And he paid no attention to him, and later on, John Bouton wrote him a letter, and later on, Gordon Stanley wrote him a letter. So
Reber had to try it for himself, you know.
There should have been almost no fringes because of the curvature of the Earth.
Yeah.
Coach you.
In the spirit of the donations which he was making, I got a letter from him just out of nowhere. He said, "Dear TK, I heard that you had been to Serpukhov, the Russian radio astronomy installation south of Moscow, and you reported that they are still using vacuum tubes as the preamplifier. Is it because they can't get transistors at high frequency work? If you know the people concerned there, I would like to send them as a gift a number of transistors He said, I wrote back saying that you can't send a gift to Russia just like that. You will have to go through various channels.
Yep.
Or if you know somebody going to visit there, you'll have to personally give it and they can give it. But then he never followed it up.
Yeah.
And the second letter was much more recent, just a little before his death. He said, TK, I want some catalogs of lumber from the lumber companies in British Columbia of the various size poles which they have for sale and what the prices are of that. So I got the catalogs from a number of lumber companies of the poles commercially they are selling. That's the last I heard.
Well, maybe he was still thinking about Graham Island.
Yes, and then finally, when he came by, he came, I think, as a guest of the Astronomical Society of Canada, maybe. One day there was an announcement in the student newspaper saying that he will be visiting British Columbia and UBC. So I said, I mean, he knew I was at UBC, but so I went to the talk. You should remember a thing. When I went and introduced myself, TK, you were at Green Bank. I mean, his memory had faded significantly at that time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Randall.
Just in random, it's interesting how generous he was, and it's quite delightful. It's curious that all these grants seem to be $50,000. There's another $30,000. There's another $30,000 when he gave to Canadian institution around that time. It was to the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Again, he wanted to be anonymous. It was originally going to be a travel grant, but it got folded into the Peter Millman Endowment Fund. This is about 1981, 1983. And there are probably people here who remember aspects of that. He was also made an honorary member of the RASC. And I don't know if that was because of the grant or not.
Do you get the feeling that he wanted to remain anonymous out of modesty, or he didn't want other people to ask him for money?
Probably a combination of both,
Okay.
actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
It hasn't been explicitly mentioned, but he lived with his mother during these Wheaton days. His father had died, and she took care of all of his worldly needs, cooking and so forth. And he had a pretty good salary all these years, steady jobs through the Depression, and he really bought stocks all through the Depression. So that really is what funded him for the rest of his life. You mentioned about the keeping down to the penny records. Jan Oort, as he was starting up just after World War II, read Reber's article about his big dish. We want to build a dish in Holland. Can you tell us roughly how much your dish cost? Reber sent a 3-page thing with every bolt and screw.
Yep.
And that dish cost no more nor less than $676.96. It turned out was the total, $700, which is about 1/3 of his annual salary at that time, to give you an idea of how much he invested in his backyard dish. And the final thing is this Foucault pendulum. Does anybody know more about this?
Ed Argyle. Tom.
Well, I talked with you offline, but I have a thing about Foucault pendulums. I'd like to learn more about that.
Sure. All right, we should wrap up. We can add some other questions we'll cover during the break. Oh, we've got pressing questions here, but I know we're really far behind now because those are two fascinating talks. Let's thank you.